So now we're going to turn our attention to the key players in the defined benefit pension scheme environment, the key personnel. And we're going to look one at a time at the role of the trustee, the scheme administrator, the scheme actuary and the scheme auditor. And I think we've mentioned all of these already to this point, but not with any great context. So without further ado, we're going to work our way through these four roles and get to understand what they actually do and their involvement with the running of DB schemes. So first up, we've got the role of the trustees. And we've mentioned these on a number of occasions that essentially these oversee the trust and are the legal custodians of the trust assets. If you are not using a master trust, which is a off-the-shelf one-size-fits-all, the trustees will traditionally include directors, senior executives and the company accountant of the particular firm. So many of the current DB schemes use master trusts where the trustees will be appointed as a third-party delegated role. However, a number of the pension schemes, particularly banks, have a master trust where they will essentially bespoke a trust to hold the assets of the pension fund. The only qualification needed to be a trustee is that you have to have the legal capacity to act as a trustee, which is broadly of majority age, 18 plus, without any financial problems registered against your name, and also of being of sound mind. But largely that's the only legal qualification that you need. However, that doesn't mean that you don't need to understand your responsibilities. You must, as a trustee, if you're appointed as a trustee, have an understanding of trust law and be aware of your responsibilities. Now, it's important also to understand that at least 1/3 of bespoke trusts must have trustees that are nominated by the members themselves. So if any of you have ever been into a large bank or been in a DB scheme, once a year you might get, coming through the post, a right to vote for a trustee, and that's because they have a bespoke trust and they are effectively going through the process of appointing member nominated trustees. In this situation, normally it's a fixed tenure, so most trustees will have a set period of time that they'll undertake that role for, after which they'll step down. So let's stick with the trustees just for a moment, and we're going to look at the trustees' responsibilities just for a moment. So these normally are the individuals that will appoint the others. So they'll appoint the actuary, they'll appoint the auditor, and they'll appoint the administrator. So when we look at each of those roles in turn and their responsibilities, it's useful to remember that generally speaking, the trustees will have actually decided to appoint them to that role. The trustees are also the legal guardians of the scheme, and they'll often appoint a fund manager to manage the scheme's assets. This fund manager, of course, is likely to be the person that will make investment decisions on that pot of cash where member and employer contributions go in. They are also the conduit into the regulator, which is the pension regulator. So any communication between regulator and the pension fund is likely to be through the trustees. The trustees, as we say, will be responsible for things like the production of recovery plans, and that's when they might bring in the other people to help them in that regard. Next up, the scheme administrator. So every pension scheme in the UK effectively is required to have a scheme administrator. And I think the name admin is a good way of thinking about the roles and responsibilities that administrators have. So essentially, they deal with all the administration of the fund. So the initial registration of the pension scheme with HMRC, which you must do in order to be able to set it up as a registered pension scheme, the operating of the tax relief on contributions, the reporting events relating to the scheme to HMRC, and there's a list of those in the pensions handbook, making annual returns to HMRC, and providing scheme information to members as requested, scheme booklets and all those sorts of things. So generally, the administrative function of the scheme will be undertaken by the scheme administrator. They'll produce things such as CETVs for those people that ask for valuations and potentially to leave the fund. All of that is generally done through this particular function. Next up, the scheme actuary, who cannot be the trustees themselves to retain an independence of the valuation of the fund. So a scheme actuary is going to prepare the periodic valuations of the fund. They will, generally speaking, provide financial advice, so to speak, generic advice about the funding, the technical provisions, and also feed into things like recovery plans that the trustees, of course, will generally get involved with if needed where there's a deficit on the fund. So it is the actuary's responsibility to certify the scheme meets its legal requirements financially, also to advise on the investment strategy. So they may bring in separate financial advisors and fund managers, as we've already said, but generally the overriding strategy of the investments in the fund are likely to come through the scheme actuary. And they'll also advise and give recommendations about the general benefits that are offered within the scheme. So the actuary, as the name might suggest, all about the numbers here, all about the numbers and planning the future strategy around those numbers. The scheme auditor is often confused with the scheme actuary, and this legal requirement essentially for the scheme to be audited is in a way that the accounts of many firms will be audited. So they must be a registered auditor, cannot be a member of the scheme, an employee of the trustees, nor connected to the company, the conscience essentially of the scheme, and they will audit the scheme, essentially making sure that everything is meeting all the legal requirements it should do and all of the numbers stack up. So you will see less and have less impact through the actuary and the auditor essentially than you perhaps will with the trustees and the scheme administrator.